It's July 23rd, 2002. In a quiet apartment in Eastlake, Ohio, a 76-year-old man locks every door and window, shuts off the air conditioning, and marks the date on his calendar. A few moments later, he walks into the bathroom and pulls the trigger of a revolver. At first, it looks like a tragic but ordinary suicide. The man had no close friends, no family nearby, and had spent most of his time living alone. But when investigators began searching for his relatives, something strange happens. The man they believed to be Joseph Newton Chandler III doesn't appear to exist. And when authorities dig deeper, they uncover something even more disturbing. The real Joseph Newton Chandler III had actually died in a car accident in Texas in 1945, at just 8 years old. And this raised a terrifying question. If the real Chandler died decades earlier, then who exactly had been living under his name for the last 30 years? Long before investigators realized that Joseph Newton Chandler III was a stolen identity, there were actually two completely separate lives behind the name, two stories that had nothing to do with each other. One belonged to a quiet American family in the 1940s. The other belonged to a man who would eventually spend decades hiding behind a name that was never his. And strangely enough, the two would only become connected many years after one of them had already died. The real Joseph Newton Chandler III was born on March 11th, 1937, in Buffalo, New York. By all accounts, his life was short and ordinary. He was just a child growing up during the final years of the Great Depression, living with his parents, Joseph Chandler Jr. and Ellie Christina Chandler. But in December of 1945, just days before Christmas, the family set out on what would have been a simple holiday trip. They were traveling from Tulsa, Oklahoma, to Weatherford, Texas, where Joseph's grandmother lived. Somewhere along the road near Sherman, Texas, their car collided head-on with a truck. The crash killed all three of them instantly. Joseph Chandler III was 8 years old. The driver of the truck walked away without injuries, and after the accident, the small boy's name slowly faded into old records and forgotten newspaper reports. For decades, no one had any reason to think about him again, until someone decided to use his name. That man was Robert Nichols. Nichols was born more than 10 years earlier, on September 12, 1926, in New Albany, Indiana. He grew up in a family with 4 boys, raised by parents named Silas and Alpha Nichols. Like many young men of his generation, his early adulthood was shaped by war. During World War II, Nichols joined the U.S. Navy and served as a firefighter aboard the USS Aaron Ward. In May of 1945, while the ship was operating near Okinawa, it was bombed by Japanese aircraft. Nichols was injured during the attack, hit by shrapnel in his back and hips. For his injuries, he received a Purple Heart. After the war ended, Nichols returned home, but something about him had clearly changed. According to later accounts, he burned his military uniforms, an act that many people who knew him would later remember as unusual and symbolic, almost as if he was trying to erase that chapter of his life. In 1947, he married a woman named Laverne Court. Over the next several years, the couple had 3 sons, and Nichols built what appeared to be a stable life. He worked as a draftsman for General Electric, earning a steady living and raising his family. For nearly 2 decades, everything about his life looked completely ordinary. Then, in 1964, something happened. Without much explanation, Nichols walked away from his family. He left his wife and children and filed for divorce that same year. Soon afterward, he moved to Dearborn, Michigan, telling his parents that he had found work in the automobile industry. For a short time, letters still arrived. In early 1965, Nichols wrote to his parents saying he had moved again, this time to Richmond, California. Around the same period, he sent a letter to one of his sons from Napa, California. And then, suddenly, the letters stopped. The family never heard from him again. Concerned relatives eventually reported him missing, and private investigators were hired to search for him in both California and Indiana. Despite their efforts, no one could find a trace for Robert Nichols. It was as if he had simply stepped out of his life and disappeared. For more than a decade, no one knew where he went. Then, sometime in September of 1978, a man walked into an office in Rapid City, South Dakota, and applied for a Social Security card under the name Joseph Newton Chandler III. The name belonged to a child who had died more than 30 years later. Using that identity, the man moved to Cleveland, Ohio, and began building an entirely new life. He briefly worked for an engineering company called Edco before eventually landing a job as an electrical designer and draftsman for Lubrizol, a chemical company based in Wickliffe, Ohio. To the outside world, he appeared to be a quiet, intelligent engineer. But people who worked with him quickly noticed something strange. Chandler, as everyone knew him, lived an extremely isolated life. He rarely spoke to coworkers and seemed to have no close friends. Most days he followed the same routine: work, eat, and return home. Even when he attended social gatherings, he kept his distance. At a Halloween party in 1992, he arrived dressed as a gangster costume, yet spent the entire evening standing alone without speaking to anyone. His behavior outside of work was often just as unusual. He sometimes spent hours listening to white noise recordings for no clear reason. On one occasion, he reportedly drove nearly 700 miles to an LL Bean store in Maine, only to turn around and drive all the way back to Ohio after discovering the parking lot was full. He was also known for tinkering with electronics, building small homemade devices in his apartment. And there were moments that puzzled people even more. In 1989, he showed up at a hospital with injuries he claimed were caused by a vacuum cleaner. The explanation raised eyebrows, but the incident was never investigated further. Even the little details about his life seemed oddly constructed. He once told coworkers he had a sister named Mary Wilson, living in Columbus, Ohio. But when investigators later checked the address he had given for her, it turned out the location didn't exist. Everything about the man seemed carefully controlled, be it his routine, his past, even the people he allowed into his life. And yet for decades, no one questioned it. Because to the outside world, he was simply Joseph Newton Chandler III. But the truth was far stranger. The real Joseph Chandler had died in 1945, and the man living under his same name had spent the next 30 years making sure no one ever found out who he really was. For decades, the man known as Joseph Newton Chandler III lived a life built mostly entirely on silence. He kept his distance from coworkers, avoiding forming close relationships, and revealed almost nothing about his past. To the people around him, he was simply a quiet draftsman who preferred to keep to himself. Then, in July of 2002, that quiet life came to an abrupt end. On July 30th, police discovered his body inside his small apartment in Eastlake, Ohio.
With no note, with no nothing, closed all the doors, locked all the doors, turned off the air conditioning. And again, what I said before, he never wanted to be found in his lifetime, even into his death.
Investigators later concluded that he had taken his own life about a week earlier. He had shot himself in the mouth with a .38 caliber revolver he had purchased only a few months before. But the scene inside that apartment revealed something chilling. On his personal calendar, the man had carefully marked the days leading up to the moment he planned to die, almost as if he had been counting down to it. Before pulling the trigger, he closed the blinds and turned off the air conditioning, sealing the room in silence. Around that time, he had also been diagnosed with colon cancer, a discovery that may have influenced his decision. Despite living an isolated life, investigators found that he had more than $82,000 sitting in his bank account. When authorities checked the emergency contacts listed for him, they didn't find family members or lifelong friends. Instead, he had written down the names of coworkers. But when investigators tried to locate any relatives of Joseph Newton Chandler III, they ran into a problem almost immediately. There were none. The search led them to an even stranger discovery. The real Joseph Newton Chandler III, the child from Buffalo, New York, had died in that car crash in Texas in 1945.
As they figured out he had $82,000 in his bank account, and they went to locate his next of kin, and the next of kin unveiled that the real Joseph Newton Chandler died in 1945.
Which meant the man, who had just died in Ohio, had been living under the name of a dead 8-year-old boy for decades, and no one knew who he really was. Because the body had been badly decomposed by the time it was discovered, investigators struggled to obtain fingerprints that could identify him. For years, the case sat in limbo, with authorities unable to determine the real identity of the mysterious man who had lived as Chandler. The truth remained buried, just like the life he had spent decades hiding. For years, investigators tried to figure out who the man behind the false identity really was. Some believed he might have been a fugitive hiding from serious crimes. Others wondered whether he had been connected to organized crime or even terrorism. Online communities began forming their own theories, studying photographs and pieces of evidence in an attempt to uncover his past. At one point, some people even speculated that he could have been the infamous Zodiac Killer. The resemblance between Chandler and the police sketches of the unidentified murder fueled endless debate online. But the theory quickly fell apart when investigators compared DNA evidence and found no connection. Other ideas were just as dramatic. Some suggested he might have been a former Nazi officer who had fled Europe after World War II to avoid prosecution. Another theory proposed that he was actually a wanted engineer named Stephen Campbell, who had recently been accused of attempted murder. But none of those theories ever produced real evidence. For years, the man remained exactly what investigators had called him from the beginning, a John Doe who had somehow managed to disappear while still alive. Then, in 2014, more than a decade after his death, U.S. Marshals decided to reopen the case. Using a preserved tissue sample from a hospital where he had once undergone colon cancer surgery, investigators were finally able to extract a usable DNA profile. When that profile was entered into criminal databases, however, it produced no matches. So investigators turned to a different tool: genetic genealogy. By comparing the DNA profile to public genealogy databases, experts began tracing distant relatives connected through shared genetic markers.
So in July, we sent in the first round to be sequenced, and we got the results from that sequencing in September, and we uploaded it to GEDmatch, as Colleen said. We had a number of matches. They were all what we would call third cousins, fourth cousins, etc. And just so you understand, a DNA match really is an individual who's tested with a company like Ancestry and uploaded their DNA results to GEDmatch.
The process took years, slowly building a family tree that pointed investigators toward a name that had been missing from the case the entire time. Robert Ivan Nichols, an engineering draftsman from New Albany, Indiana. In 2018, the identification was finally confirmed when DNA matched one of Nichols' sons.
The DNA profile from Chandler was sent to the lab in Cuyahoga County. Dr. Fitzpatrick and Press was sent to them for comparison in Y-DNA genetic databases. Dr. Fitzpatrick and Press were able to determine that Chandler's real last name was Nicholas, or a variation of Nicholas.
After decades of questions, the man who had lived as Joseph Newton Chandler III was finally identified. But even with his real name restored, the deeper mystery still remained. Why had Robert Nichols abandoned his family in the 1960s? Why did he spend the rest of his life hiding behind the name of a child who died in 1945? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, what was he running from?
Now, what he was running for, if he was running from anything, at this point, I just don't know.
Because even though investigators eventually discovered who he was, Robert Nichols took the real story of his life with him to the grave.